Howdy folks, welcome to the Daily Coin. My name is Rory and today is Wednesday, February the 14th. Happy Valentine's Day to everyone. And I have the very distinct honor and great pleasure of welcoming back to the show someone who I hold in very high regard. He is constantly on the lookout for solutions. He's very solutions oriented, and I love that about what he does and the work that he and his partner Adam Taggart do over at Peak Prosperity. And of course, I'm referring to Mr. Chris Martenson. Chris, welcome back to the Daily Coin.
Rory, it's so good to be back here with you and all your listeners today.
Well, I'm glad that you're here. I want to read something that former President Richard Fisher of the Dallas Federal Reserve said in January 2016, just after he retired from the Federal Reserve. Of course, afterwards he can come out and say whatever he wants. And this is what he said. Quote, "What the Fed did, and I was part of that group, is we front-loaded a tremendous market rally starting in 2009. It's sort of what I call the reverse wimpy factor." End quote. And if you remember, Chris, Wimpy always, his famous line was, "I will happily pay you on Tuesday for a hamburger today." So what Richard Fisher is saying is, I'll happily pay you today for a hamburger on Tuesday, which is, that's pretty messed up if you think about it for just a minute. And then he goes on to say, Richard Fisher goes on to say, basically we had a tremendous rally, and I think there's a great digestive period that is likely to take place now, and it may continue. We front-loaded at the Federal Reserve an enormous rally in order to accomplish a wealth effect. Or what we are seeing right now, Chris, with the volatility in the market, these tremendous spikes up and tremendous spikes down, and the ongoing wealth effect that obviously the Federal Reserve is admitting that they are creating all of the rally, that there's nothing to it other than what they are doing. What is causing this? Is this part of the digestive period that Richard Fisher was referring to? Is this tied to what Janet Yellen has done with raising the Fed funds interest rate? You know, these 3 or 4 different menial raises. What's happening right now? Are all these things tied together? What do you see going on?
You know, Rory, I'm reminded of a scene in the movie National Treasure. Remember, you got Nicolas Cage, and then Harvey Keitel is this FBI agent trying to track down. And at the end of the movie, towards the end, Harvey Keitel says, well, somebody's got to go to prison, right? And the reason I'm reminded of that is that we can short circuit all this discussion about where markets are going or have we front-loaded rallies by just saying, when the central banks of the world put $15 trillion of thin air money into the markets, well, they had to go somewhere, right?
Right.
So it's no mystery where they went. $15 trillion doesn't just go under a mattress. It doesn't just, stuff into an offshore Cayman account to sit in physical currency. You got to do something, right? So that's what Harvey Keitel would have said. It's like, well, what do you expect was going to happen? That money had to go somewhere, right?
Right.
So something had to rally. And it turned out everything rallied. So this is the mother of all bubbles. And listen, let me be nice for a second and imagine that the Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, the Bank of Japan, they aren't just a bunch of self-interested, self-promoting, self-aggrandizing, ego-driven schmucks who make all of them and their friends fantastically wealthy while mouthing about doing things that are going to help Main Street or the little person, right? Let me just pretend for a minute that they actually thought they were doing good.
Okay.
Well, the only story that makes sense is they said, well, we're going to jam markets higher, just like Bernanke said. It's going to create this thing called the wealth effect, and then the economy will start growing. Well, cool. Try that for a year. Try it for 2 years. But we're 10 years into this experiment. What do we got? GDP growth that's hovering around the 2% mark. We have $100 trillion of brand new debt stretched everywhere on the sovereign side, corporates, household debt, student debt. It's everywhere. And we don't have anything that you can point to and say, there's some robust organic growth. that we can point to. So it's been a colossal failure. They could have noted this 9 years ago, 8 years ago, 7 at the most. But they're still doing it because they got fantastically wealthy doing it. And if you really understand the story of money printing, let me strip it down real bare. Central banks do not create wealth. They redistribute wealth.
Right.
They take from one place and they give it to another. They pick the losers and they pick the winners. So that's what's happened in this story. It's social engineering. It's being done by people who have no experience of it. Nobody should actually consider themselves a vast social engineer. Hitler tried it, Mussolini, other people. It's a crazy thing to try, but that's what they've been doing, is a social engineering project that says, what happens if we vastly increase wealth inequality, income inequality, we do it in a really unfair way, and we do it in a really obvious way? What could go wrong, right?
Besides everything.
Besides everything? Not much. Let's just, Venezuela, that's what's wrong.
Yeah.
They're just ahead of us in this story. That's all. That's what happens when your money system is badly, badly managed and it's done in a deeply unfair way, whether we call it socialism or this so-called pseudo-capitalism. We don't have capitalism. Let's be clear about that. Capitalism is free markets where there's actual competition. There aren't government-sponsored cartels that put barriers to entry up against everybody else, right? So yeah, money is too important to be fiddled with, and that's what the central banks have done, and they've monkeyed with it over and over again. And what your listeners need to know, Rory, is that when this mother of all bubbles bursts, we're going to have the mother of all crashes. Unlike anything ever seen in history, it's going to be global, it's going to touch everything, and it's going to be really hard to escape no matter how well you prepare.
Now, this is going to be at the central bank level. In the previous two major crashes, we had the S&L crash back in the 80s. Then we had what is kickstarted what we're discussing right now. That happened in 2000, started in 2006 and materialized in 2009. And that was at the banking level, at the big bank level. And now we are at the central bank level. And like you said, it's global. No one's going to be able to escape it. So what do we do? I mean, like I started the show off praising your solutions-oriented mind and approach. What do we do? I mean, is gold and silver going to be able to protect us? Is cryptocurrencies going to be able to protect us? Is a combination of that going to be able to help the person on the street? And I mean, what are we supposed to do? I mean, I don't want to be washed away in the tidal wave of this madness, and I'm doing what I believe to be the right thing to protect my family, but I may not be on the right path.
Well, this is a particularly tricky conundrum, because if you were getting swept up in, I don't know, the Weimar printing experiment of 1918 to 1923, there were 5 nearby borders to escape over. You could get to France, you could get to Switzerland, Italy, pick one. And there was a way to escape. And this time I can't find a location in the world. Like, would it be China, Singapore, New Zealand? Everybody's doing the same thing. And we've all sort of bought into the same sets of mistakes. And so there's going to be pain coming. And I think in this story, one of the things that I'm trying to engineer towards is I have to think about this in terms of relative losses. So people who lose the least win the most in bubble bursts. And by definition, and this is the hard part, everybody can't escape the ravages of a bubble. In fact, by definition, even 50% can't. Usually it's a much, much lower percentage because they're Ponzi schemes. You need more new people coming in to keep it going. And then as soon as the first people leave, really it's only the first few people out the door before the whole thing's revealed as a fraud, right? And then, it's very hard. Everybody after that just gets stuck. So really, as best as you can prepare or I can prepare, listen, I got a lot of solutions, things I think everybody should do. I'm convinced I have a way of relatively losing less than most, but I'm still going to be impacted. I'm going to know friends and family and loved ones who wouldn't listen to me or didn't take me seriously or didn't understand what I was saying, who are going to lose jobs, lose retirement prospects, be impacted, which means I'm impacted. So I don't think there's this was such a colossally bad idea. And it started in the late 1970s, early 1980s. And here was the bad idea. we're going to borrow at twice the rate of our income growth. We borrowed at close to 9% per year compounded, and our economy was growing at less than half that the entire time. So that's just a math problem. That's what broke in 2008. Would have been a great time to allow a couple of big, derelict dinosaur banks to go under. Goodbye, Citi. So sorry, all you Citi bondholders. Caveat emptor. Do better due diligence next time. Oh, see you, J.P. Morgan, and buy Goldman. Right? That would have been great. And then it would have been bad, but we would have picked up and kept going. That, to me, Rory, was the equivalent of falling off like an 8-foot step ladder. It's painful, right?
Right.
But now we're about the 23rd step up an extension ladder, and now it's possibly beyond painful. And that's the thing, makes my message difficult because people don't want to hear that. They don't want to understand that, no matter how well they prepare, they might still be impacted. So that's just on that side. But if you can let go of the idea that you have to preserve everything you've got or gain or make money while everybody else is losing, if you can just sort of relax into this idea that this is tricky territory, that we want to be happy, healthy, whole, and safe today, and we'd like to be that way tomorrow as well, and that if you can approach this period of time as an extraordinary period of change where we're going to lose a bunch of stuff, right? We might, lose $99 flights across the country. I don't know, right? Whatever. We'll be letting go of some things, but there's going to be incredible opportunities coming after a pretty disruptive period. And so that's what I'm really coaching people towards is how do you keep crisp mental focus? How do you stay in the game? How can you be one of those people who can still maneuver while everybody else is frozen? That's the relative advantage that's going to matter most because there's going to be incredible bargains. There will be new ways. Listen, the dust settles and this all picks up and keeps going again, maybe
Right.
at a lower level, but it keeps moving. And those who can see that coming, right, they're going to be way better off than everybody else. I think generational fortunes are made and lost in this next 10-year window.
Okay. Yeah, that in 10 years, that seems to be about right as far as, because the collapse is happening now, or the transition. It's not really, I don't know that it's going to be an all-out collapse, but the transition from where we're at to where we're headed is already, in my opinion, is happening right now. It's unfolding right now. And do you see during this transition, Chris, do you see the United States or Europe or even other nations, larger nation states that are supposedly, well developed, like China or Singapore or Australia, even Russia, descending into what we see that's happening in Venezuela? That country has gone from having some serious issues and real problems to really deteriorating and falling into total chaos in a very, very short period of time.
Well, indeed, Rory, that Venezuela is a failed state at this point in time. And if your question is, can we see other failed states in here? Yeah, absolutely. Greece is not that far away from failing in this story. I know it's been out of the news lately, but they really got pushed into a deflationary hellhole by the European Central Bank and the Troika in Brussels. And it wouldn't take another serious knock, really too serious of a knock, to get them going down that particular hole. The Italian banking system is so riddled. We could see that happen there as well. And so with a failed state, what you're really seeing is the political system is no longer trusted and the rule of law is exposed as a fraud, and sort of gangs, whether they're gangs of judges and police or however the tribes begin to form as self-interest, and your money system no longer works and your commerce begins to break down. And it's a very, very difficult thing to stop once it gets started. And, as you'd say, like, this collapse to me is not going to be something we're going to wake up next Tuesday and here it is.
Right.
It's already happening.
Right.
And if you open your eyes, you can already see it. Look at the opioid deaths and addiction rates. Those are people checking out from a system that they don't know how to participate in. That's a failure, right? You look at the number of homeless people. I don't know if you've seen the videos of people driving mile after mile through LA or other places, and it's just seas of people, many of them formerly middle class, right? We have adjunct faculty in the California state school system sleeping in their cars, right? These are all just points of failure, and maybe we could recover from them. But when we look at what's happening here, those signs of decay are nibbling from the outside in, and we could reverse them. But the first thing we'd have to do, Rory, is we'd have to have a national, coherent strategy and story that says, "Wow, we got to go a different direction." But my healthcare bills just shot up again. The deductibles shot up again as part of that. Um, I'm not detecting anything from, the Trump administration just outlined a plan which has roughly 6 trillion of new debt being tacked on in the next 5 years as if it doesn't matter. We see pension systems failing all over the place. Nobody has a plan for how to address those. Oh, by the way, pension plans are heavily exposed to stocks now. So if there is a stock downturn that continues, those get ruined. On and on and on because we didn't have a plan. We didn't have a strategy, and that's where you and I come in. We talk to average people, and we say, "Listen, if there's no larger plan that makes sense, you got to make your own plan."
Right.
That's just how that works.
That's how it works, and that's what I love about you is that you bring a sense of calm to the table that is absolutely needed right now because for those of us that are paying attention, we see nothing but people that are out of control that continually lie to us.
Hmm.
They present these falsehoods as truth, and then they try to silence your voice and they try to silence my voice. But the good news is that we're not going to be silenced, and we're not going to allow it. And the audience isn't going to stand for it. I think that there are more and more people that are beginning to understand the fact that the mainstream media is nothing but a propaganda machine, and that they are there for the sole purpose of supporting the shadow government, the deep state, whatever you want to call them, in order to further their agenda, whatever that agenda is. When and their primary agenda is stripping us of our wealth. With gold and silver, Chris, that has been, or throughout quite a bit of history, they have been stores of wealth. They've been treated as currency, as money. And once we get through this transitional period, do you see them coming back to the table and taking their rightful place as currency, as money, as stores of wealth, and being able to bust through this manipulated nonsense that we're dealing with? Or do you think that something else is going to take their place? Or how do you see, what are your thoughts on gold and silver as far as getting through to the other side?
Well, Roy, there's two big battles being waged right now. One is sort of hemispherical, meaning West versus East. The United States and Europe, particularly the UK, particularly England, are attempting to preserve this idea that the West is where all the action is, and that we get to call the shots all over the world. And of course, China's is just absolutely come roaring along. And of course, you've got Russia having sort of been forced into the China camp by actions by the neocons in particular out of the West. And so with China and Russia as the East in this story, and Europe and the United States as the West, what you really have is a story where those two parties are vying for power. And if you don't understand where we really are in the oil story and what's really happening in the Middle East, you can't make sense of any of it. But it turns out that what you've been nibbling at is this idea, and with gold and silver as a placeholder for this idea, which is that real wealth is actual real stuff, right? And the realest of the real stuff is energy. I don't care how much gold or silver you have. If you don't have energy, you got nothing, right? You can't have an economy. And if you don't understand the role of oil, and by the way, apologies to anybody listening to this who is confused, because in the United States, we've been just subjected to the most extraordinary propaganda campaign to convince us that wind and solar are about to displace oil. When you just scratch at that story and you discover that wind and solar make these things called electrons, electricity, and oil gives us petrochemicals that are used for innumerable processes, and we use it for transportation. Electricity and liquid fuels have nothing to do with each other in this story yet. They might in 20, 30, or 50 if we're smart, but today, zero to do with each other, practically. Rounding to the nearest whole number, it's zero. So in this story, it's just the most magical, amazing substance, oil, and it's actually not as abundant as people have been saying. I get to hobnob and talk with petroleum engineers, former executives in the oil business, including president of Shell, and all of these people are singing the same tune, which is, yeah, that stuff's getting harder to find, and they don't even question the idea of peak oil at Chevron, at Shell, at Exxon. They don't even internally, they get it. So once you understand that, this is the story, and you can see that West versus East thing starting to build a little bit, the first question around gold and silver is, who's going to win this story, right? And note that China is the world's largest importer of oil now, by far.
Right.
Note that they're buying oil all over the world. Note that on March 26th of this year, 2018, they are going to begin trading oil futures, not in dollars, but in yuan, their onshore currency. And that's never happened before in the history of oil since the United States came on board with the petrodollar. And this is a seismic shift. So the first question is, how does the West versus the East view gold and silver? And the answer is, the East has been accumulating like crazy. Russia's central bank, but also Russians in general, Chinese central bank, Chinese citizens in general, as well as India, all accumulators, net accumulators of gold and silver. So that's where that's going. And so in this story, if you want to believe that the West is going to win this story, you have to believe that we can somehow militarily defeat what China is up to economically. Last time I was in China, a Chinese person very presciently said to me, he said, Chris, the business of the United States is war. The business of China is business.
Right.
I'm one of these people who believes that oil is a tricky substance to transport. You need 1,000-mile long pipelines that are very fragile, and single stick of TNT disrupts them. You need very slow, large explosive VLCC ships to transport this stuff. It's something that business facilitates, war makes impossible. And so that's part one of this story. And then part two is this idea that the state of the West is just out of control. And this is all across Europe and the United States. They want to eliminate cash. They want to enhance spying. Congress, even Republicans were all upset about this memo signed off on the next FISA extension, which totally strips any guarantees of protections and allows the NSA to continue just its vast electronic eavesdropping and spying program, including listening into us right now, guaranteed. And yep, because they sweep everything up. It's not they're looking. Yes. I don't feel picked out. I'm just saying it's just part of the game. So what the state would love to do would be, they don't like stuff like gold and silver. They don't even like cash. They don't like anything that allows you to escape their ability to harvest your wealth from you anytime they want. And so that's why I'm very suspicious of the whole cryptocurrency side of things, because it came out of nowhere. The Treasury Department never stepped on it. It was just like, oh, well, gosh, what a crazy thing came out of nowhere. No, it didn't. The government obviously is tracking this stuff very carefully, and it served a purpose. So it was allowed to run. And, a lot of people early on were confused and thought crypto meant anonymous, and nothing could be exactly further from the truth.
Thank you. It doesn't mean decentralized, and it doesn't mean anonymous.
Nope, none of those things.
It means the exact opposite of those two things, actually.
Yeah, it's like the Healthy Forests Act that Bush put under, which accelerated cutting of forests. You just gotta flip the statement that's been presented, 1984 style, and just say, oh, it's the opposite.
Right.
But that's the world we live in. So really, there are those two big battles: West versus East, and individual rights versus state autonomy, and that's the big battle. So I think people for themselves have to decide. Not was gold 6,000 years of monetary history, which is true, but who's going to win this battle? How do you think this is really going to fall at this point in time? And I'm not that worried about gold really being targeted beyond the obvious blatant sort of manipulations they do in the markets. I'm not worried about that Confiscation Act, because that's not where really there's a whole lot of wealth there yet. I don't know how old this statement is. I believe it comes from Roman times, but it may predate. It's that the last official act of any government is to loot the treasury. Now, the Treasury used to be the place where all the gold and silver was kept, but now what's the Treasury? Well, it's money market funds, it's 401k funds, it's large pension holdings. That's where it's deposited. As soon as I see the government come in and say, for the people's own benefit, people turn out to be lousy managers of 401ks. What we're going to do is we're going to replace their current holdings with special obligation Treasury bonds, paying a certain special coupon rate. That'll be a large scale seizure moment right there. So that would be the sort of stuff when I see that happening, I start to get real nervous because you don't know how far down that chain we're going to go. But to be really clear about this, real wealth has always been land, buildings, machinery, productive property, plant, and equipment, and real tangible assets. Right, fresh water, deep soils, all that. That's real wealth. And then, all the stuff that we talk about as wealth that's marketed to us as wealth are just claims on stuff that's actually wealth. Right. So
Right.
once people understand that, you say, what are the steps? What are the solutions? I say, well, there's 8 forms of capital you can build up, including, my own forms of capital include the depth of the soil in my garden out back and how many different animals and I have, and birds and bees I have come into my property because I've planted all these things that they benefit from, I benefit from. It's the health of my body. It's how good my relationships are with all the people I know. It's my emotional stability and health and things like that. Those are the things that are going to be the real assets going forward, and those are the ones that are non-seizable, except under the most dire of Venezuela-like circumstances. But then the story has a different sort of a flavor to it.
Yes, much different, and one that's not really tolerable for most people. I mean, not even the Venezuelans. I mean, nobody wants to go through what these folks are being subjected to. I mean, nobody. It's just not.
Right.
It's not right. Well, Chris, I'm not gonna. That was beautiful, by the way. Thank you. I'm not going to take up any more of your time. We've been speaking with Mr. Chris Martenson over at Peak Prosperity. And Chris, why don't you tell them about what you've got going on at Peak Prosperity and some of the upcoming events?
Well, certainly. So peakprosperity.com, it's about 90% free, all the content that's there. We got a lot. And our signature offering is something called the Crash Course. It's a video series. You can find that if you have just a little bit of time. Try the Accelerated Crash Course. It puts all these dots together into a story that begins to hopefully make sense. And that's part 1, is the information you need so that you understand what's happening. And then part 2 is, what do you do about it? And that's really the focus of most of the site. Our second book out, Adam Taggart and I, is called Prosper. Talks through all 8 forms of capital, how to build them up. And these are things that will be serving you today and in whatever future arrives, whether it goes this way or that. Trust me, you won't regret being in better shape and having better friends. So at any rate, that's what's going on there. And we do have a subscription newsletter service for people who like to go deeper and like to be kept up to date with what's happening in the world. And you can find that there as well under our Enroll tab if you want. And we do have a seminar coming up in May, but it's sold out in just 3 weeks. So I shouldn't even probably mention that. But we have a fabulous seminar we put on once a year, and it's a good time.
Well, sounds like you need to add a second date.
Sounds like we might.
Well, all right, Chris. Well, like I said, I'm not going to take up any more of your time, and I certainly appreciate all that you've given us today. And I look forward to speaking with you in the not too distant future.
All right. Likewise. Thank you, Rory.
All righty.